Welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm your host today, Rath Wang, bringing you the latest global news and analysis from a Taiwan perspective. Chip Tsao joins us for a special episode on the Chinese Communist Party's erosions of freedoms in Hong Kong, a city that once boasted as one of Asia's freest. We look at what this means for Taiwan and the rest of the freedom-loving world. Tsao is one of the top names in Hong Kong media. He was an editor, host, and commentator in the region's channels, including producer for the BBC. Tsao provides in-depth insights on political, economic, and social developments, not just in Hong Kong, but around the world. A warm welcome to the show today. Chip, can you talk a bit about human freedoms, what that means to you, and what it means to the people of Hong Kong?
Well, I grew up in Hong Kong in the 1960s and 70s. During the old colonial days, I mean, freedom had been more or less like an indispensable oxygen. We grew up with that part of core values.
And you feel that's been taken away now?
We feel being suffocated or a little bit, or stifled bit by bit because of the implementation of the national security law, which is being practiced and carried out by a bunch of quite rigid and robotic local bureaucrats in Hong Kong who keep second guessing what their supreme master in Beijing is going to like. So that's a bit of a problem. Plus a self-censorship, the growing self-censorship from all walks of life, especially from media, if there's anything left, and from the industrial and business circle, friends from the chat groups, they are closing down, or they're becoming quiet, and there's a huge sense of self-alienation, that this integration of comfort zones, right before and after the national security law. I mean, I used to have friends and old colleagues and school alumni or whoever chatting to each other on a very friendly basis. But since then, especially since I left Hong Kong, some people seem to get a little bit worried, and they've been alienating some of their friends, including myself or whatever. I mean, that self-censorship is everywhere, is in the air.
Can you talk about leaving Hong Kong? Was it because of the national security law?
Well, I mean, it's one of the reasons. I think it's because I didn't like the smell in the air. I thought Hong Kong has changed fundamentally. People look and talk very differently.
It feels less free.
Pardon? Oh, well, less free, of course. As I said, during the 1960s and 70s, Hong Kong people were very free to be critical, except the Crown, right? Because it was a colony, and there wasn't much worth criticizing.
Since the Queen of England was far away.
No, it was far away, and it was a benevolent, some kind of benevolent dictatorship. Freedoms were very much allowed and tolerated.
How has life changed in Hong Kong with the gradual erosion of freedoms, as we've seen in Hong Kong?
Yes, and Hong Kong was a trading pot, and the kind of free market economy, to a very extreme degree, was being practiced, as you may know, with very little social security. We didn't get no money because Cantonese people are very hardworking. We are used to looking after ourselves, our families, and etc. So I think the British colonial government took advantage of that and treated Hong Kong as a laboratory of the kind of capitalism of the most radical form. So it was, ironically, very successful, and all freedoms existed apart from the freedom of doing business. And of course, you need freedom of information, right? That would come from a free media. And it has been like that for decades, since I was born. And after the handover in the 1997, because China was governed by what you call the Shanghai clique, right? Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin. And Jiang Zemin was born well before 1949, and he was educated in Shanghai during the old days. I think he carried to some extent some Western values. At least he could happily recite some, I don't know, Lincoln speech or whatever when he was on his overseas trips. Right? But now China has a totally different leader who was born and who grew up in the Yellow River district in the northern China, and he sees the world in a different kaleidoscope.
It's interesting you mentioned that because Xi Jinping spent a bit of time in the U.S. Do you feel that did not influence
too
any of
short,
that?
and he is too deep rooted in his Yellow River or Yellow Earth social and cultural origin of China. Is an anthropological issue, right? But that's the problem with China ruled by the CCP. It's a one-man band, it's a one-man authoritarian system. So sometime you got Deng Xiaoping, who seemed to be very open-minded, who just picked up a cowboy hat and put on his head on his trip to America in 1978, making many American people very happy, thinking that, wow, this is an open-minded leader. If China would go on like this, he would be able to make the world a better place.
And there was hope that China would follow the example of Hong
Exactly.
Kong. I wanted to go back to what you mentioned earlier in terms of gradual change. And Hong Kong used to be, as we know in Asia, a beacon of freedom, and people wanted to come over to Hong Kong. But if you look at the numbers from the Freedom Index, with them being one of the top countries in terms of personal freedom in 2010 and gradually going down from 2014 with the umbrella movement. And perhaps the national security law was the last coffin in the nail in the coffin. Do you feel that Hong Kong and the umbrella movement, and in terms of freedom, is there a direct link to that?
Yes, the fall of Hong Kong is inevitable. It's a part of a process of change of global strategy by Xi Jinping and China. Right? He feels confident now that he should call the shot by changing the world order that was put down at the end of the Second World War. The United Nations, the WTO, and the World Health Organizations, and all the kind of intergovernmental bodies. He finds it uneasy and uncomfortable for China to continue to abide by such rules as a result of globalization. And China under him is very anxious to change that basic fundamental global order. And Hong Kong has been a victim during that grand process of readjustment. Right?
Chip, can you talk a bit about what freedom means to you and what it means to the people of Hong Kong?
Well, I think it was triggered by the former Chief Executive Carrie Chang, who tried to legislate a law that would cause the arrest of many Hong Kong businessmen across the border, right? And it caused grave concern among business communities in Hong Kong, and then as the world, as you may know, resulting in more than 1 million people taking to the street.
And this is the anti-extradition law.
That's right. The anti-extradition law was then revoked as a result, but people asked for more, the long overdue promise of universal franchise, right? So the can of worms, was reopened, and all of a sudden, it was just like a part of globalization. Young people in Iran and Thailand and Burma, they were all doing the same thing during that same period, and they're still doing it now. You live in a time of globalization.
Chip, so you're talking about the globalization of authoritarianism.
Globalization of liberty as well. The globalization of digital freedom, you know. And the young generation has been calling for that across the borders. So it's common globally among many people. Yes, I mean, they were all asking for the same things. You know, young women in Saudi Arabia, young people in Iran, you know, university students in Burma, you know, who protested against the military government and who were brutally cracked down, you know, a couple of years ago, right? And you see countries like Afghanistan, you know, where the clock is being turned back, right? So it's this global tide of conflicts between the authoritarian regimes and demands of the young people. And Hong Kong has only been a piece of a jigsaw of that global picture. And it was a perfect time. It was a perfect storm at a very interesting time.
Do you believe it, if happened like a year later, would there be a different outcome? Say if the protests didn't happen in 2019.
No. The storm would take place, would happen, more or less. And look at Macau. It had been very quiet for years. Macau people had been very obedient and submissive to China's rule. And Beijing still cracks down on the gambling industry there, arresting a local gambling tycoon on the charges of money laundering or whatever. And he had been very patriotic and politically very loyal to Beijing. So it's just one of the many episodes that are taking place at a very unfortunate time. So as Hong Kong people, protesters, used to say, you know, we burn, you burn. So if Hong Kong falls, another series of domino cards, you know, are falling as well. And then you can see what happens in Ukraine and in Europe or whatever. You know, Western countries are getting a little bit nervous because they are now able to see the consequences of what used to happen in Hong Kong and in Burma and in other countries as well. I mean, China is now forming an alliance, potential alliance with Russia. And as the cliche goes, we live in a world like what it used to be in the 1930s.
With Iran as well, they're meeting, I think, in Beijing very soon with the Iranian president and all U.S. adversaries.
Oh yes, it's all deja vu if you are even an amateurish historians, you know. I mean, history repeats itself. It's the same old stories, same old tricks. But now it's a different player called China, which is much stronger. You have everything made in China on the shelf of supermarkets and Walmarts, whatever. And you have Chinese students in MIT and Berkeley, but you don't have that from Russia. So I think the West is waking up to the nightmare or the reality that if China, you know, gangs up with Russia, it could well be, as Zelensky recently said, the beginning of the World War III. It's a real crisis, unseen since 1945. Right?
As they say, it's better late than never.
You know, the world is getting paradoxically eccentric and grotesque, right? I mean, scientifically, we live in a very advanced age, but politically and socially, rather, the clock has been turned back to more than 100 years ago, just like what experts commented on how the war is being fought in Ukraine by the Russians. You know, it was more or less like the Second World War.
Interesting times indeed. You know, we'll talk more about what that means for Taiwan and the future of Hong Kong in our next section. Beijing's national security law has dramatically changed Hong Kong. Sangpu, can you talk a bit about what the national security law prohibits?
This so-called NSL, National Security Law, prohibits 4 types of crimes, namely secession, subversion, terrorism, and also collusion with foreign forces, which are all punishable by a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. and there is no automatic right to default rule as a right to jury, and also detainment precedes bail, as the detainment will be the default rule going forward. And this stirred up a lot of crisis, because all these concepts of secession, subversion, and terrorism and collusion with foreign forces are ill-defined and subject to very arbitrary determination by the so-called NSL designated judges, which are, after all, CCP controlled. So it is very horrible, and I think this is the dark age of Hong Kong.
Indeed. How does it compare to other national security laws in other countries?
The fundamental difference will be different, because for other countries, the security laws, they are to protect a democracy, a liberal democracy, which is obeying the rule of law concept. But for this Hong Kong national security law, it is protecting a CCP regime. Many of us would deem the CCP regime as a new colonial giant for Hong Kong. And without any consultation, without any kind of democratic votes to support this kind of law. And all these concepts are not subject to judicial review. It is against the fundamental concepts of rule of law. So the subject to be protected is an autocracy of CCP, and it is not elected, not represented by the Hong Kong people. So as you know, this is fundamentally different.
Sangpu, can you talk a bit about how many people have been arrested since?
If you count the numbers, there are more and more numbers counting day by day. But if it's up to the end of October of 2022, you will see that it is 10,279 people arrested under the concept of national security. Of course, it is apart from national security law, there are other subversion laws in Hong Kong. If you count them all together, up to 31st of October 2022, 10,279. And the ages are between 11 to 86 years old, okay? And among them, you will see that 2,915 are now subject to judicial process. And 2,800 were arrested. And among them, there are already 1,170 already being convicted. And convicted means they are either being subject to appeal or either in the jail. I met many of my friends and comrades who are now all in the prison now. So it is a sad day. These are sad days for Hong Kong.
Chip, we've seen the closure of Apple Daily and the arrest of Jimmy Lai, which was broadcasted throughout the world and talked a lot in Taiwan, being one of Taiwan's largest media, as the Apple Daily was also Taiwan's #1 media for many, many years. What does that mean for Hong Kong and for freedoms here?
Yes, I mean, because Apple Daily and the next media run by Jimmy Lai has been more or less seen as a window for Hong Kong people to look through, at the world, and vice versa, right? And the Apple Daily and next media are not just about reporting on current affairs and politics. It's got a very rich feature sections. Right?
And it's actually been one of the largest medias in Taiwan as well, number one for many years.
It had been introducing many updated news and information from the West and from the world, right? And through which I knew what the term political correct was like. And I knew what was going on in Berkeley and MIT on campuses, the Black Lives Matter and all these neoliberal values, right? And gender politics and racial equality or whatever, to the latest Best Movie Awards, from Oscar, right? Things like that. And young people and people of Hong Kong have been updated with what was going on in the world. But now that window is being closed down, it's being blocked. So I think my Hong Kong friends have been telling me they are being fed with very one-sided view of what's going on in the world, right? Just like what happened at the International Security Conference in Munich, right? they are only able to see the silhouette of one man, Mr. Wang Yi, talking, the former Chinese foreign minister, without knowing much what other world leaders' reaction to China's position is. So it's more or less like Shenzhen and the mainland China. They are being fed with one-sided view, and they are not getting a complete picture of information of the daily world.
Chip, it's interesting you mentioned self-censorship. How much of that is in Hong Kong, and how much of it is actually handed down from the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing?
And that's really worrying, because Hong Kong, for more than 100 years, had been an international financial and trading port. People there need to know what's going on. If you want foreign business and foreign investment, right? Businessmen and other professionals there may not be interested in when universal franchise would take place in Hong Kong, but they must know what's going on in China, especially in China, across the border, in cities like Wuhan. Why are there old people, gathering in the streets, protesting against the cancellation of their medical pension or whatever? And what would be the consequences? And now it's all blacked out, because local Hong Kong TV stations, they used to send their reporting crew across the border quite freely for the past 25 years. But now they are not allowed to go there under the pretext, with the excuse of COVID. And the lockdown the news and information lockdown has been longer than the physical segregation as a result of COVID. And that seems to be a permanent state. And that's going to undermine Hong Kong's status as a financial city. That's why the money is leaving. That's why foreign investments are going, moving away from Hong Kong and to other cities like Singapore. Right?
So Chip, you don't see that changing with
no, I
zero
don't think
COVID
so.
being dealt away with?
COVID has been used as an excuse, we all know that. But now COVID is even over officially declared over in China. But that status quo of news and information lockdown in Hong Kong is still going on. Right?
How much of that is self-censorship?
Oh, it's everywhere, because people are very afraid. They get scared. I don't know why.
Is that because of the vagueness of the law of the national
Yes, the
security
vagueness of the war, the wordings, are very unclear, and they can do whatever they want. It's the interpretation of clauses and articles, right? It's totally up to the judiciary and the government, right? So people get very uneasy. They think they are faced with an unstable future. And Hong Kong wasn't like that, right? We used to live in a time when we were very certain, we were able to go to school and go to work every day.
And there was high trust in the judiciary system,
yes,
being unbiased.
Because of a common law system laid down by the colonial British.
Chip, can you talk about Hong Kong's journey from being a former British colony to one country, two systems, and to post-national security law?
That has been promised by the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law to remain unchanged for another 50 years. But now Beijing and the Hong Kong SAR government claims that the national security law is there above the common law, or even above the basic law, right? And that's a great change, So Hong Kong people and the business circle find that the core values that have been existing in Hong Kong are being badly twisted. Right? I mean, they openly claim that, don't take it for granted.
There's also been an exodus of people from Hong Kong that have been vocal about the erosion of freedoms.
Well, according to the status of the British government, I think so far for nearly 2 years, those Hong Kongers who exercise their right as BNO passport holders there have been more than, I don't know, 150,000 or more who have emigrated to Britain and left Hong Kong. Most of them are professionals, you know, from the medical sectors, and some of them teachers, or even lawyers, you know, financial experts or whatever, and also unprofessional people who would prefer working in supermarkets and warehouses, right? And just because they want to bring their kids over to Britain for a better future, especially in education.
It's concerning indeed with the number of people leaving
Yes,
Hong Kong.
people are still leaving.
Chips, apart from the Hong Kong people, there's also been a group of expats who have left Hong Kong, mentioning the erosion of freedom. How much of that is actually happening now?
Oh, that's a good question. There is quite a percentage of Western expats who choose to live in Hong Kong because they still believe that China's has got a brilliant future. You know, I don't know how honest they are when they talk about that, but some do say that. You know, you idiots are leaving Hong Kong and moving to Britain. We have just fled from there. What's going on there? You know, inflation, the Tory government, right? Strikes everywhere, and high inflation. Whereas in Hong Kong, we are having a good time. You know, there's wining and dining. There are plenty of sushi wongs there for us to pick up, right? And it's low-cost living for them, because some of them are working for some Wall Street banks. You know, they have been living in cities like Hong Kong and Shanghai, and even Beijing as a privileged class, as a result of China's open door policy since the 1990s. So they have been there as a class of financial aristocracy. You know, I think it's a very subtle form of racism that they think, oh, I mean, democracy what's the big deal? We have democracy in England. We have democracy in America, and people like Donald Trump, you know, make a mess of it. And you Hong Kong Chinese, you know, you're not updated with your enlightenment, right? They have that kind of patronizing attitude. Right? I'm not sure how many there are or whether they are speaking up the truth, because one or two of them have even given up their Canadian or British citizenship
To become
for the
PRC
sake
citizens.
of getting richer, you know. But their family, as far as I know, still keeps their British or Canadian passports. They are very clever, you know. So I mean, yes, it's interesting that you mentioned that. You know, views are not all the same in Hong Kong. Some expats do think that staying in Hong Kong is in the best interest for them.
But there are concerns from the expat community.
Yes.
As we've seen with the American Chamber of Commerce's and all
Yes.
that. How influential is
Even Joe Biden many years ago was very much impressed. He used to say, oh, is China going to take away our lunch? No, it isn't. China has done a good job. It's been able to lift more than, 70 million people out of extreme poverty.
It does seem that the world tides have changed with
Yes.
Joe Biden and all that. And
Joe Biden, it was triggered by Donald Trump, I would say accidentally. He was like a bull, you know, in a China shop. He was rather destructive.
Biden claims to be a builder, so we'll see that contrast, how interesting that could
Yes.
in the future.
I think Biden has been a very professional, veteran politician.
So what does this all mean for Hong Kong, Chip?
Hong Kong has been like a Cinderella party, unfortunately. The clock is tick-tocking, or has tick-tocked to midnight. It's been a fairy tale, right? Hong Kong would only flourish, unfortunately, under the British rule, right? I mean, where the British people could achieve, alongside the hardworking and industrious nature of the Chinese people, right? Unfortunately, that model had been terminated. It was terminated in 1997. I believe in the Platonic notion that democracy may not be the best form of human existence, right? and he invented the theory more than 3,000 years ago. And yes, what if all the internet users, online game players, if they are given the right of one man, one vote, right? It could be a little bit dangerous. Plato warned it more than 3,000 years ago. If one man, one vote is practiced, if the mass is ignorant, right?
Well, you needed an informed citizenry.
You need an elite. You need an elite class to lead. I mean, that's what the Democrats, that's what Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama believe, right? But what if the elites themselves get corrupt because of money, because of lucrative profits, generated from the Wall Street and Silicon Valley? I mean, there's a circular argument. That's a problem that mankind has not been able to solve since the ancient Greek time, right? So, I mean, that's why some people in the West are getting a little bit disillusioned.
But compared to autocracy,
democracy is still a very much better form.
though flawed.
But I think these flaws and shortcomings are only temporary. So long as you allow people to speak up their mind, democracy would win and triumph eventually. And depends on how democracy can be corrected. I mean, the West has its own problems, and the Russians and the Chinese, can see it clearly. As Putin has said at the beginning of his invasion of Ukraine, he was very critical of some radical liberal values, right? Debates in America, gender politics, or that sort of things, And he was very clever to take advantage of this time of weakness, to make his advance in Ukraine. I think that would serve as a warning to the West that things could be getting a little bit too far domestically.
We'll talk about that wake-up call in our next section.
There's China's military buildup that has definitely made it more difficult for the United States to come to the defense of its allies and partners in the region. There is cyber attacks. There's disinformation, economic coercion. There's stealing of intellectual property, unfair trading practices, industrial policies that are aimed at achieving technological dominance. There's activities to undermine Western democracy and put forward China's own model of governance as more effective for developing countries. There's the selling of surveillance equipment around the world. I mean, truly, this goes on and on and on. But it is imperative to establish priorities because the United States, even alongside its partners and allies, cannot respond to all of these challenges. So we need to identify which ones are the most pressing, the most urgent, and which ones do we have the potential to protect first our own interest, but then perhaps also to influence China's policies going forward.
In terms of those priorities, are there any areas Taiwan can support, or vice versa, the U.S. can support Taiwan on?
I think that there are areas where the U.S. and Taiwan are already working together, and countries, not just the United States, can learn from Taiwan. Taiwan has, I think, been the target of more disinformation and cyber attacks probably than any other country coming from China. And therefore, I think that Taiwan has developed some creative ways to more effectively protect itself from those kinds of threats. So I think that's certainly an area where the United States and other countries can learn from Taiwan, and Taiwan can learn from the United States and other countries, and for example, economic coercion.
We just talked with Chip about how the world is coming to the realization of the aggression of the Chinese Communist Party and how democracies are readjusting from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. Chip, I wanted to go back to Hong Kong. Is there still hope for Hong Kong to be what it once was, the jewel of Asia?
Well, there isn't much for Hong Kong now. I mean, Hong Kong people have more or less done their job. The youngsters, right, they've done their duties. They wanted to speak up, and they did. They pay a heavy price, right? So it will be up
and
to
many are leaving.
Many are leaving, you know, if they are not, they feel very little choice. And now it will be up to the rest of the world to face, right, the reality or future, what kind of world they are going to live in, right, with the factor of China. I mean, Hong Kong has done this part, I'm afraid. You know, it's a closed chapter, more or less, for the time being, right? It would be up to the West, you know, what's going on in the Munich, right? In the Munich Security Conference, what kind of decisions are going to be taken?
What will it take to change the Communist Party?
Now, it will be up to more than, I don't know, 90 million Communist Party members in the country to think seriously.
Although they say it's one person deciding everything.
Their fate is being decided by one person. How comfortably they're going to be able to sleep every night, I'm not sure. Right? But I think they know their country is on an economic and political suicidal path. I think the foreign minister, who's been very outspoken as a mouthpiece of their warring wolf diplomacy, he perfectly knows that. As an actor,
with his criticism of the U.S. Is
yes,
that what you meant?
I mean, he's doing his job. He's reading out his lines according to his script. But I think as a veteran diplomat, as a former ambassador in Japan, he knows much better than his boss what the world is like. And now he's under stress, right? So it will be up, it's their problem, you know. And Hong Kong has done its duty, and it will be up to the West what to do.
What can we do here in Taiwan, you feel?
Now,
Being the next Hong Kong, as
Taiwan
people
is
say.
very interesting. The geographical name of Taiwan has suddenly emerged on CNN, BBC World Service, everywhere, Time Magazine and New York Times. And yet, I'm sure the majority of people in the West don't know what Taiwan is and where it is on the map.
Though they might know it's the world's most dangerous place, as economists put
All
it.
of a sudden, Taiwan is becoming the Ukraine of the Far East. And they hardly know what it is and where it is and its history. So compare with France and Britain, with the Alliance Française and British councils, or even Japan House everywhere. Even China has got its own Confucius institutes everywhere, and Taiwan has got none of such equivalent. So it has not been able to tell its own story for decades. I mean, cultural stories and historical stories, etc. So all of a sudden, the world is waking up to a blank piece, right, of the map. Right, so I think it's quite a matter of emergency for the Taiwanese government, whatever political party is ruling this tiny, beautiful island, to tell the story to the world. I mean, considering its 400 years history, it was the first the first hub of globalization alongside Columbus. It was part of that story when the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Dutch were sailing past Macau, Hong Kong, and then through Taiwan Strait, and they wanted to reach as far as Japan to spread Christianity.
Well, that's how it got its name.
Exactly.
Ilha Formosa.
Exactly, Formosa in Portuguese, and Taiwan in Dutch, when they touched base with the Aboriginals on this island, and then followed by Japanese occupation and the Chiang Kai-shek's occupation. And the Taiwanese people here from Fujian, they are still under a bit of an identity crisis. There are a lot of movies and films about that, you know. And Taiwan's story is a part of that globalized story, you know, of 400 years ago. And if that globalization has been going on continuously through the Industrial Revolution to the modern age, and Taiwan is still very much a part of human life today. And yet people are waking up to a very blank page, you know. So I think it's a matter of urgency for Taiwanese government and the people
So
to come
through
out.
that story, you feel it could deter China and its aggression?
No, it won't deter China, but it would win more hearts and minds from the rest of the world. And the more hearts and minds you are able to rally around you, morally and culturally stronger Taiwan is going to become. And that's an advantage, you know. Eventually, you know, it's moral that counts, you know, in the final showdown between the good and the bad, right? So I think it's very important for Taiwan to do. And what else can you do? I mean, America has always claimed that Taiwan is a part of their Pacific Ocean interests. You know, the Americans, whatever parties, for whatever party they see, Taiwan is in a different perspective.
Well,
They
it's part of
see
the first
Taiwan.
guiding
They
chain.
see Taiwan as a part of the Western Pacific. They don't see what Beijing claims the Taiwan Strait. They don't recognize Taiwan Strait. They recognize the Western Pacific, and Taiwan is a part of the chain, right? Okinawa, Japan, Okinawa, Taiwan, and the Philippines, right? That's the horizon in the vision of the Americans. And now it's the clash of the two visions, right? And Chinese, mainland Beijing doesn't see it that way. So that clash of visions, you know, is taking place, and that could lead to a war, right? And that's what Taiwanese people are facing, torn apart between the two visions, right? And such conflicts have to be settled down. It's the right time for the showdown now. So it will be up to the Taiwanese people to decide, you know, what
So
they're
do you
gonna
feel
do.
military conflict is inevitable, Chip?
I think it's a matter of time, you know. It's not a matter of whether, it's a matter of when. Because now Xi Jinping is more and more convinced that it would be his duty as a modern Chinese emperor to make that achievement, to make himself comparable to Deng Xiaoping and even Chairman Mao. It's his own personal dream. Now, how much that personal dream can be allowed by the Communist Party and the people of China to take place with a very heavy price to pay on the part of the Communist China and the Chinese people is a different matter. You know, it would be up to them to put their foot on the brake. I believe that it could happen sometime in the near future. Before that, the whole world had to get prepared and geared up for that, alongside the Taiwanese people.
Going back to Xi Jinping, there's always been calls that he hasn't always made the best decisions. As we've seen with the NSL, how Taiwanese people have actually been propelled to vote for a particular party in spite of or fears of being close to Beijing.
Yes.
Do you feel that Xi Jinping will make the same mistake again with calls within Hong Kong to revise the Basic Law, Article 23, with sedition, things that could harm the Chinese central government?
Well, very much hinges upon the personality of Xi Jinping, of this one man. I think a lot has to be studied by experts.
But in hindsight, it could be good for Taiwan because it protects
Yes.
the sovereignty of
I mean,
the current Taiwan.
paradoxically, it's been a bit of a blessing of disguise for Taiwan and for many other countries. The more extreme he's willing or he's prepared to go, right, the more other countries, like including Taiwan, to get on alert, right? So, I mean, the Cinderella party is over for Hong Kong, is over for China as well. Because China has claimed that by the year of 2025, you know, it would realize its goal of making the whole world, you know, under the control of by one slogan, made in China, right, including chips to to T-shirts, from chips to T-shirts to jeans, right? And America has been waking up, right, to that warning. You know, it's served as a wake-up call for everyone. And Joe Biden and Donald Trump have both unanimously decided, together with the Congress, that they are not going to allow that to happen. And they've made that decision. So there's something big going on in the coming 2 or 3 years. It will be up to Xi Jinping to decide how to respond. And it will be up to him to assess what kind of damage, collateral damage, would cause to his own party and to his own people. It's a big moment for everybody. And Taiwan, during this time, will have to make up their mind with the Taiwanese people.
And Chip, being on the same boat, Hong Kong and Taiwan, receiving aggression from the Chinese Communist Party, how can both peoples work forward to ensure that these freedoms aren't further eroded?
Well, I think at this stage, I mean, the Hong Kong and Taiwanese people have been sympathizing with each other. There's been a lot of empathy going on. And the common people have been in touch in Taiwan, taxi drivers, you know, workers and cleaners and common people. They are very sympathetic with Hong Kong. They know what's been going on, right? They know, they've been telling me, you know, I know what decision I'm going to take in the next presidential election. However, there are a lot of domestic flaws and problems in Taiwan. We've got the democratic government, and some of the officials are corrupt. I think, yes, we should learn our lessons from each other, right? And
look at the big picture is what you're saying.
Yes, I mean, what can the Hong Kong people who choose to stay in Hong Kong do? There's very little they can do. Either they believe in a future with the Bay Area of their own motherland, or, you know, they think leaving Hong Kong is a better choice. It's a time for them to take side, I'm afraid. There isn't much room for anyone to adopt a role like Switzerland, right? Even Singapore is under the pressure of taking side, right? So I think that moment is coming.
Indeed, not having it all, choosing what's best for you is what you're saying.
Choose your own core values.
And that is authoritarianism versus democracy.
I mean, if you put it that way, yes, right? I mean, choose the form of life you prefer to take for yourself and for your families and for your children.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.